Imagine becoming the version of yourself that never breaks and slowly realizing you can't step out of it anymore. Nothing collapses, yet something keeps fading underneath. And the more in control you seem, the less you understand what you're losing. This isn't about resilience. It's about what staying strong quietly replaces inside you. There's a version of you that people recognize instantly, the one who doesn't overreact, the one who absorbs tension instead of creating it, the one who listens longer than they speak and fixes things without announcing it. It looks stable from the outside, reliable, controlled. But stability, when it's constant, starts to become something else entirely, something less like balance and more like suppression wearing a calm face. What most people don't realize is that staying strong isn't a reaction anymore. It becomes a role. And roles don't ask how you feel. They just expect you to perform. At first, it's subtle. You choose not to say something because it doesn't feel worth it. You decide to stay quiet because it keeps things smooth. You hold back irritation because it seems unnecessary. Each moment feels small, logical, even mature. But over time, those small decisions don't disappear. They accumulate, not as memories, but as weight. And that's where it starts to shift. Because strength in this form isn't about resilience anymore. It's about containment. You're not processing emotions. You're managing their visibility. And those are two very different things. Think about the last time something actually affected you. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. Maybe someone dismissed you. Maybe something didn't go the way you expected. Maybe you felt overlooked. You probably noticed it for a second, then adjusted. You told yourself it didn't matter. You moved on, but that moment didn't end. It just went underground. And here's the part that's easy to miss. When emotions don't get expressed, they don't disappear. They change form. They become tension in your body that you can't quite explain. A kind of low-level exhaustion that doesn't go away with rest. A subtle distance between you and everything around you. Not dramatic enough to alarm you, but persistent enough to reshape how you experience things. It's not burnout. It's not stress. It's something quieter. It's what happens when you become too good at holding things together. And the strange part is, the better you are at it, the less anyone questions it. People start to depend on your calmness. They trust your composure. They expect your consistency. And without realizing it, you start maintaining that image. Not because you want to, but because breaking it would feel unfamiliar. But that's not the real reason it's hard to stop. The real reason is you don't fully remember what it feels like to not be that person. Because over time, the line between who you are and how you manage yourself starts to blur. You don't know where the role ends and you begin. And that confusion doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal, which makes it harder to notice. You might even start thinking this is just who you are. Someone who doesn't need much. Someone who handles things internally. Someone who doesn't rely on others. But what most people don't realize is that kind of independence isn't always natural. Sometimes it's learned, not through choice, but through repetition. You learn that expressing too much creates friction. You learn that needing something complicates things. You learn that staying composed keeps everything stable. And slowly, you stop checking whether those lessons are still true. You just continue them. And that's where something begins to erode, not suddenly, not obviously, but consistently. Because every time you choose control over expression, you're not just managing a moment, you're shaping a pattern. And patterns don't stay small. They expand into how you think, how you respond, how you connect. Until one day, Something feels off. Not wrong, just distant. Like you're present, but not fully inside your own life. And that's where it gets more complicated, because what you're experiencing doesn't look like breaking. It looks like functioning. And that's exactly why it goes unnoticed for so long, until you start to realize that the strength you've been relying on isn't holding you up anymore. It's holding you in place. But that still doesn't explain why letting go of it feels harder than keeping it, even when it's quietly draining you. There's a quiet shift that happens when you've been strong for too long. Not the kind that shows up in obvious ways, but the kind that rearranges how you relate to everything without asking for permission. You start noticing that your reactions don't feel like reactions anymore. They feel calculated, measured, almost pre-decided before anything even happens. It's not that you don't feel. It's that your feelings go through a filter so fast you barely recognize them as yours. And that's where it becomes something else entirely, because strength, when it turns into habit, begins to replace instinct. You don't respond naturally, you respond appropriately. You don't say what comes up, you say what fits. And over time, that constant adjustment creates a distance, not from other people, but from yourself. What most people don't realize is that this kind of distance doesn't feel painful at first. It feels efficient, clean, even peaceful. But that's not the real nature of it, because when you remove the friction of expression, you also remove the signal that something needs attention. You don't feel the need to pause, to question, to explore. Everything just moves forward, smoothly, quietly. And that's where it starts to cost you something. Not in a way you can point to, not in something you can explain easily, but in something you begin to notice in moments when there's nothing to distract you, when things are quiet, when there's no role to play. There's a kind of emptiness that doesn't feel like sadness, but also doesn't feel like peace. It feels like absence. And that absence isn't random. It's the result of something being consistently set aside, because every time you override a feeling to stay composed, you're not just avoiding discomfort. You're postponing contact with something real. And postponed things don't disappear. They accumulate in a different way, not as intensity, but as disconnection. And here's where it becomes even more subtle. You might start believing that this is actually a good thing, that being unaffected means being in control, that not reacting means being stable, that not needing means being independent. But what most people don't realize is those ideas are only half true, because control without expression becomes rigidity. Stability without movement becomes stagnation, and independence without connection becomes isolation, just a quieter version of it. But that's not the part that breaks you. The part that slowly starts to wear you down is something much less obvious. It's the constant effort of maintaining something that no longer adjusts naturally, because real strength is flexible. It bends, it responds, it changes depending on what's needed. But when strength becomes identity, it stops adapting. You stay the same, even when the situation doesn't. You remain composed, even when something inside you is asking for a different response. You hold steady, even when there's nothing left to hold. And that's where the exhaustion begins. Not from what's happening around you, but from what you're not allowing to happen within you. It's a quiet kind of fatigue, the kind that doesn't go away with rest, because it's not physical, it's structural. You're holding a version of yourself in place, and that takes effort, constant effort, even when nothing is happening. And the strange part is, you don't consciously choose it anymore. It just runs in the background, like a default setting you forgot you installed. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is what happens when something finally breaks through that system. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to disrupt the pattern. Because when you've been containing everything for so long, even a small crack feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things don't feel safe. So instead of exploring it, you suppress it faster. You reinforce the pattern. You double down on the strength. And that's where the cycle tightens. Not because you're weak, but because you've learned to avoid the very signals that would allow you to adjust. And that's the uncomfortable part most people never talk about. Staying strong doesn't just protect you, it disconnects you from the feedback you need to stay aligned with yourself. And without that feedback, you don't know when something inside you is asking to change. You just continue, steady, controlled, unaffected, until one day, that steady feeling doesn't feel stable anymore. It feels heavy, but that still doesn't explain why something that once helped you survive now feels like it's quietly turning against you. Because the real issue isn't the strength itself. It's what that strength has been built on, and what it's been silently replacing this entire time. And that's where things begin to get deeper. Not in what you do, but in why you learned to do it this way at all. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. There's a point where staying strong stops being a choice and starts becoming the only way you know how to exist. Not because life demands it every moment, but because you've trained yourself to default to it, even when nothing is happening. And that's where the real conflict begins. Because on the surface, nothing looks broken. You still function, you still respond, you still handle things in a way that feels correct. But underneath that correctness, something doesn't quite align anymore. Not sharply enough to alarm you, but consistently enough to create a quiet tension you can't fully name. What most people don't realize is that this tension isn't coming from external pressure. It's coming from the gap between what you feel and what you allow. At first, that gap is small, almost unnoticeable. A moment of hesitation before you speak. A slight adjustment in how you respond. A decision to keep something to yourself because it doesn't seem necessary to share. It feels efficient, clean, even responsible. But over time, that gap doesn't stay small. It widens. Not because your emotions become stronger, but because your tolerance for expressing them becomes weaker. And that's where it starts to invert. Because instead of emotions adapting to you, you start adapting to the absence of them. You get used to not reacting. You get used to not needing. You get used to translating everything you feel into something manageable before it ever reaches the surface. And eventually, that translation becomes automatic. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is what happens when something doesn't translate properly. Because not everything can be reduced into something calm. Not everything can be processed into something controlled. Some things are meant to disrupt you, to move you, to force a response that isn't polished. But when you've built your identity around staying steady, disruption feels like failure. So instead of letting it exist, you compress it. You override it. You return to the version of yourself that knows how to hold everything in place. And that works until it doesn't. Because the more you override something real, the less access you have to it over time. And eventually, it's not that you're choosing not to feel. It's that you don't fully know what you feel anymore. There's just a general sense of something being off, a kind of internal static, not loud enough to interrupt your life, but present enough to change how you experience it. And that's where it becomes difficult. Because you can't fix something you can't clearly identify. You just continue operating, You keep showing up in the same composed way. You keep responding in the same controlled tone. You keep maintaining a version of yourself that works externally. But internally, something starts to flatten, not collapse, flatten. Your reactions become less varied. Your emotional range becomes narrower. Not because life is simpler, but because you've reduced how much of it you allow yourself to engage with. And that reduction feels like stability. But that's not what it is. It's limitation, disguised as control. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Because when you live like this long enough, you stop expecting anything different. You stop imagining what it would feel like to respond freely. You stop considering that your internal experience could be wider than this. You adjust to the narrowness, and that adjustment becomes your normal. But that's not the real cost. The real cost is what happens to your sense of self when everything you feel has to pass through a filter before it becomes visible. Because, over time, you don't just filter your emotions, you filter your identity. You become someone who is known for being composed, reliable, unaffected. And that identity gets reinforced by how others respond to you. They trust you to be steady. They rely on your consistency. They expect you to remain the same. And without realizing it, you start protecting that expectation. Not because you want to, but because stepping outside of it feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things, especially when they involve losing control, don't feel safe. So you stay where you are, even if something inside you is asking for more. But that internal request doesn't come as a clear message. It shows up as restlessness, as quiet dissatisfaction, as moments where everything is technically fine, but nothing feels fully right. And that's where it starts to hurt, not sharply, not suddenly, but persistently, because you're maintaining something that no longer fits you completely, but you don't know how to stop maintaining it without feeling like you're losing something essential. And that's the conflict, not between strength and weakness, but between control and access. You've learned how to control everything you feel, but in doing that, you've slowly lost access to experiencing it fully. And without access, you don't just lose intensity, you lose clarity. You don't know what you want. You don't know what you need. You don't know what actually affects you anymore, because everything feels filtered before you can even examine it. And that creates a kind of internal distance that's hard to explain. Not distance from others, distance from yourself. But even that isn't the deepest layer of the problem, because underneath all of this, there's a reason why this pattern formed in the first place. Not as a flaw, but as something that once made sense. And until that reason becomes clear, the pattern doesn't feel optional. It feels necessary, which is why even when it starts to break you, you still hold on to it. The part that's harder to face isn't what this pattern is doing to you now. It's where it came from and why it still feels justified even when it's quietly wearing you down. Because this didn't start as control for the sake of control. It started as something adaptive, something that worked. There was a time when being composed wasn't a role. It was a solution. Maybe not a conscious one, but a consistent one. You learned in ways that didn't require explanation, that reacting too openly created consequences, that showing too much could shift how people responded to you, that staying steady reduced friction. So you adjusted, not dramatically, just enough to keep things manageable. And that adjustment paid off. You avoided conflict. You kept things predictable. You became someone who could be relied on. And in environments where unpredictability felt risky, that reliability wasn't just useful, it felt necessary. So you repeated it. And repetition turned it into instinct. But what most people don't realize is that instincts don't update automatically. They keep running, even when the conditions that created them are no longer present. And that's where the distortion begins. Because the same behavior that once protected you starts operating in situations where it's no longer needed. You respond to ordinary moments with the same restraint that was once reserved for difficult ones. You filter reactions that don't require filtering. You stay controlled, even when there's no real risk in not being. And over time, that mismatch creates something subtle. You start experiencing safe environments as if they still require caution, not consciously, but structurally. And that changes how you move through everything. You hesitate where you don't need to. You hold back when nothing is being asked of you. You maintain a version of yourself that was designed for a different context entirely. And you don't question it, because it still feels familiar. But familiarity isn't the same as accuracy. And that's where it starts to disconnect you. Because when your responses are based on outdated conditions, your present experience becomes filtered through something that no longer fits. You're not reacting to what's actually happening. You're reacting to what you've learned to expect. And expectations, when they're misaligned, don't just shape behavior. They shape perception. You begin to interpret situations through a lens of control, even when openness would be more appropriate. You assume that expressing something will complicate things, even when it might clarify them. You default to self-containment, not because it's needed, but because it's automatic. But that's not the deepest layer. The deeper layer is what this pattern slowly convinces you about yourself. Because when you consistently suppress certain responses, you don't just hide them. You start to question their legitimacy. You begin to see your own needs as unnecessary, your own reactions as excessive, your own emotions as something to manage rather than something to understand. And that shift is quiet but significant. You're no longer just controlling your expression. You're redefining what you believe is acceptable to feel. And that belief system doesn't stay contained. It expands into how you evaluate yourself. You measure your stability by how little you react. You measure your strength by how much you can carry without showing it. You measure your independence by how little you need from others. And those measurements feel valid because they've been reinforced over time. But what most people don't realize is that those standards are incomplete. They reward containment, but ignore connection. They value consistency, but overlook flexibility. They emphasize control, but disregard responsiveness. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to optimize for the wrong things. Not because they're harmful in themselves, but because they're only part of the picture. And when you build your identity around only part of something, the missing part doesn't disappear. It just goes unacknowledged, until it starts to show up in indirect ways. In moments where you feel disconnected without knowing why. In situations where you can't access a clear reaction. In relationships where something feels distant, even when everything is technically fine. In decisions that feel neutral, even when they should carry weight. And those moments don't point clearly to the source. They just create a sense that something isn't fully aligned. But alignment requires awareness. And awareness is difficult when your default response is to smooth everything out before it becomes noticeable. So the pattern continues. You keep maintaining control. You keep filtering responses. You keep reinforcing the identity of being the one who doesn't break. Not because you believe it's perfect, but because it's predictable. And predictability feels safer than uncertainty, even when that uncertainty might lead to something more accurate. But that safety comes with a cost that isn't paid all at once, but over time. Because every time you choose predictability over authenticity, you move slightly further away from something essential. Not something dramatic, something foundational, your ability to respond in a way that reflects what's actually happening inside you. And without that, your life doesn't fall apart. It just becomes less connected, less precise, less real. And that's the part that slowly starts to break you, not visibly, not immediately, but structurally, because you're maintaining a system that was built for survival, in a context that now requires something else entirely. But the system doesn't know that, and unless something interrupts it, it will continue running, quietly, efficiently, and at your expense. The shift doesn't start by trying to become a different person. That approach tends to fail quietly because it treats the pattern as something external, something you can replace all at once. But this isn't something you remove, it's something you adjust. Because the strength you've built isn't the problem. The problem is how narrowly it's being used. What most people don't realize is that control isn't meant to be constant. It's meant to be responsive. It's supposed to expand and contract depending on what's actually needed. But when it becomes your default, it stops responding and starts overriding. So the first change isn't about expressing more. It's about noticing earlier. Noticing the moment before you filter something, the moment before you translate a feeling into something more acceptable, the moment where a reaction appears and then gets reduced almost immediately. That moment is small, but it's where everything begins to shift. Because if you can recognize that point, even briefly, you create a space that didn't exist before. A space between what you feel and how you usually handle it, and that space isn't there to force a different reaction. It's there to give you access to something that's been running automatically for so long, you stopped seeing it as a process. But that's not the real change. The real change happens when you stop treating every internal response as something that needs to be adjusted, because not everything you feel is a problem to solve. Some things are just information, and when you allow that idea to settle, even slightly, it changes how you relate to your own reactions. You don't rush to smooth them out. You don't immediately reframe them. You let them exist long enough to understand what they are. And that doesn't require a dramatic shift. It doesn't require you to start expressing everything openly. It just requires a different kind of attention, a slower one, a more deliberate one. Because when you stop compressing every reaction into something manageable, you start to notice patterns that were invisible before. You notice where you consistently hold back. You notice where you default to control without needing to. You notice where your responses don't match what's actually happening inside you. And that awareness doesn't overwhelm you. It clarifies something. Because now, instead of operating on a single setting, you start to see that there are other options. Not extreme ones, subtle ones, like allowing a reaction to last a few seconds longer before you adjust it. Like acknowledging internally that something affected you, even if you don't express it outwardly, like choosing not to immediately resolve a feeling into something neutral. These are small shifts, but they change the structure because they reintroduce something that's been missing: flexibility. And flexibility doesn't mean losing control. It means not needing to apply it everywhere. But that's not the part that makes it sustainable. What makes it sustainable is understanding that your strength doesn't disappear when you stop using it constantly. It becomes more accurate, more precise, more aligned with what's actually happening. Because now, instead of using control as a default, you're using it as a response. And responses can change. They can adapt. They can reflect something real. But there's still a hesitation that comes with this shift. Because even when you start to notice these moments, even when you allow a little more space, there's a part of you that wants to return to what's predictable. Not because it's better, but because it's familiar. And familiarity has a way of pulling you back into patterns that feel safe, even when they're limiting. So the process isn't linear. You don't suddenly stop filtering everything. You catch it sometimes, you miss it other times. You allow something through, then immediately question it. And that inconsistency might feel like you're not progressing, but that's not what's happening. What's actually happening is that the pattern is losing its automatic control. Slowly. Not completely, but enough to create openings, and those openings matter more than consistency, because they show you that the pattern isn't fixed, it's adjustable. And once you see that, you can't fully go back to not seeing it. But that still leaves one question unresolved. Not how to notice, not how to create space, but how to move differently without feeling like you're losing the part of yourself that kept everything stable for so long. That concern, losing what once kept everything stable, isn't something you ignore. It's something you understand more precisely, because the stability you're holding on to didn't come from being strong in itself. It came from being consistent in how you applied it. And consistency, when it's too rigid, starts to limit what it was meant to support. So the shift isn't about removing that consistency. It's about widening it, widening what you allow within it. Because right now, your version of stability likely depends on keeping your internal experience within a narrow range. You stay composed, you stay measured, you stay controlled. And that creates predictability. But predictability isn't the same as alignment. And alignment is what you've been missing. So instead of asking, how do I stop being this way? The more accurate question becomes, where is this no longer fitting? Not in a dramatic sense, in a precise one. Where are you responding out of habit instead of relevance? Where are you maintaining composure in moments that actually call for a different kind of response? Where are you holding something steady that doesn't need to be held at all? Those questions don't force change, they reveal it. Because once you start identifying those mismatches, the adjustments become more natural. You don't need to push yourself into unfamiliar behavior. You just stop applying the same response everywhere. And that's where something begins to open. Not all at once, but gradually. You start to experience moments where your reaction feels more connected to what's actually happening. Moments where you don't immediately override something real. Moments where your internal response doesn't feel like something you need to correct. And those moments might feel small, but they carry a different quality. They feel accurate. And accuracy changes how you experience everything. Because now, instead of maintaining a version of yourself that works in general, you're allowing a version of yourself that responds specifically. And specificity creates something that control alone never could. Clarity. You begin to understand what actually affects you, what actually matters to you, what actually requires your attention, not based on what you've trained yourself to minimize, but based on what's genuinely present. And that clarity doesn't make you less stable. It makes your stability more real, because now it's not built on reducing everything to something manageable. It's built on recognizing what deserves to be managed and what deserves to be felt. But this doesn't turn you into someone who suddenly expresses everything. It turns you into someone who no longer needs to suppress everything by default. And that difference is subtle, but it changes the direction completely, because now your strength isn't something you rely on to maintain control. It's something you use when it's actually needed, and that makes it lighter, more sustainable, less tied to your identity, more connected to your awareness. And over time, that changes how you experience yourself. You don't feel like you're holding everything together anymore. You feel like you're moving with it, responding to it, adjusting when necessary, allowing when possible. And that shift doesn't make your life easier in a simple way. it makes it more aligned, which is a different kind of stability entirely. One that doesn't require constant effort to maintain. One that doesn't depend on limiting what you feel. One that doesn't quietly disconnect you from yourself in order to function. And that's the part that changes everything. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. Because you're no longer trying to be the version of yourself that never breaks. You're becoming the version that doesn't need to hold everything in place to feel stable. And that version isn't weaker. It's just no longer confined to one way of existing. And once that becomes visible to you, even briefly, it's hard to go back to living entirely inside the old pattern. Not because you've rejected it, but because you've seen beyond it. And there's something about that awareness that doesn't close again easily. So you don't need to rush this. You don't need to force anything. You don't need to prove that you've changed. You just continue noticing. Continue allowing small shifts. Continue paying attention to what feels more accurate instead of what feels more controlled. Because there's more to uncover in that direction. More that hasn't been filtered yet. More that hasn't been reduced. More that hasn't been held back. And if you're willing to keep exploring that, you'll start to see something different, not just in how you respond, but in how you exist within your own experience. And that's where this doesn't end. It opens. There's more waiting there.